In this video, we'll examine some of the physical privacy and security components that are available to help to improve the overall level of security for your devices, particularly mobile devices such as laptops, tablets, and phones, which can make these devices more difficult to compromise when compared to using measures such as only something like a password or a PIN. So we'll begin with biometric security devices, which require some kind of additional input to grant access based on physical characteristics of the user, such as fingerprint readers, facial recognition, iris scanners, and voice recognition. So beginning with a fingerprint scanner, this is perhaps one of the more common types of biometric security, usually found on a laptop, but also many tablets and smartphones. But it's usually in the form of a small pad onto which your finger is placed, and the device will then scan and store the unique pattern of your fingerprint in a secure internal database. Since every fingerprint pattern is unique to the individual, it can then be used in place of or in addition to a password. If you're only using the fingerprint to gain access, from the perspective of the user, this makes accessing the device much faster and easier. And if you're using both the password and the fingerprint, then it makes the device that much more secure because both are required. But it should be mentioned that the added security certainly doesn't mean that fingerprint scanners can't be circumvented. For example, an intruder could physically force you to swipe your finger to gain access. And if that's the only thing required to gain access, then they don't even need to know your password. Facial recognition is, of course, exactly as it sounds. The system can identify and use unique markers, shapes, and structures of the user's face to gain access. But of course, this requires that the device has some kind of camera, either built in or externally installed. But the structures that are identified are then converted into mathematical data, and only your particular facial image will allow access. Now, when configuring facial recognition, be mindful that factors such as aging, glasses, hats, or anything else you might be wearing can affect the reliability of the service. And just like fingerprint scanners, they are by no means infallible. Again, an intruder could physically force you to present your facial image to the device, or depending on the quality of the device itself, it could be possible that a photograph fashioned into a mask could succeed in fooling the scanner. An iris scanner might not be as common, and if it is being used to gain access to the device, it's probably in the form of an external device. But iris and/or retinal scanners generally aren't used to gain access to computing devices. Rather, you would likely see them being used to control physical access to a secure room or a facility. And I should mention that iris scanners and retinal scanners both perform the same general function in that they use the unique patterns and structures of the user's eye to grant or deny access. But an iris scanner uses the external pattern of your eye, or that which is visible to any observer, whereas retinal scanners use the internal pattern and usually require that the user be much closer to the scanning device. Again, while they certainly can improve security, just like fingerprint scanners and facial recognition, an intruder could still force you to present your eye to the scanner to gain unauthorized access. Another option is voice recognition, although among the biometric security measures we've covered so far, this method would likely be the least common, primarily because it's the easiest to circumvent. Like the other methods, the computing device will sample characteristics of the user's voice to grant or deny access. But an intruder who is skilled at imitation could easily gain access, and in some cases, using a recording of the original user's voice might also succeed in gaining unauthorized access. Beyond the biometric security features, there are additional options, including near-field communications, or NFC, which is an extension of RFID, or radio frequency identification, but the range is intentionally very short, quite literally a matter of inches, so that intruders can't pick up secure information from a distance. Common applications of NFC include quickly synchronizing data between devices, such as contacts between your laptop and your phone. And if you have a bank card or a credit card that has been issued within the last few years, then it is very likely that you have made use of NFC to make payments, a feature many of us simply know as tap. At any point of sale that supports tap, all you have to do is hold your card in very close proximity, usually within a few inches, and the reader will pick up the information embedded within the chip on the card to process payment without any prompts to the user. Again, while certainly very convenient to the user, it should be noted that this type of payment application is perhaps the easiest by far to circumvent. An intruder need only steal your card to be able to make purchases because there's no PIN required when using tap. That said, most financial institutions implement limits on the amount that can be spent using tap to ensure that any losses are as small as possible. Plus, most payment or banking apps these days allow you to lock the card yourself once you realize it has been lost or stolen. So then NFC might raise the question, why do we need NFC if we already have Bluetooth? Well, for starters, Bluetooth requires that the communicating devices be paired with each other, whereas NFC does not. Requiring pairing would effectively defeat the convenience of using NFC for something like making payments. And Bluetooth, while still very short in range, can still carry up to around 30 feet on average, easily far enough for an intruder to obtain secure information, whereas NFC devices just about need to be in contact with each other to communicate. And due to that very short range, NFC is much less prone to interference from other radio sources as compared to Bluetooth. In short, each of these security measures and/or communication methods have their pros and cons, just like anything else, but they have all led to much more convenient access methods and easier methods of communication. Just always remember that no means of security is 100% effective, so it's still important to make sure that you remain diligent with your devices and protect your data as effectively as you can. In this presentation, we'll talk about LCD or liquid crystal displays, which have effectively become the standard for laptop computers and flat panel monitors, and most certainly have become the successor to the older cathode ray tube or CRT monitors, which used to be about the only type of display available for desktop computers if you go back about 20 or 25 years, primarily because they were very bulky and cumbersome by comparison to an LCD monitor. Typically, they were as deep as they were wide across, so they took up far more desk space, and larger monitors would be quite heavy as well, easily 4 to 5 times as heavy as modern LCD screens. So by the time LCD started to become more cost-effective, CRT monitors all but disappeared. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the younger viewers may not have ever seen a functioning CRT display. But the primary issue with LCD displays when they were first released was the cost. They were much more expensive than CRT monitors. But as the technology became more and more prevalent, the cost began to drop. And I would estimate that perhaps around 2005 to maybe 2007, CRTs were just about gone in most workplaces and even most home environments. Now, not only did the cost of LCD monitors come down, but the technology continued to improve as some early implementations suffered from distortions of the image based on the viewing angle, which still happens to a degree even today, but far less than what it used to. Today, LCD screens produce very high resolution and very clear images. They're cost effective and they take up far less space than their predecessor. Now, LCD is a technology that is based on using a liquid crystal material that is effectively sandwiched between two clear plastic sheets with a light source behind everything to provide illumination. The liquid crystal material is then divided into many small squares, each one representing a single pixel of the image. Each square in the display is independent of the others, and each is capable of 32-bit color depth, meaning that a total of 2 to the power of 32 colors can be displayed, which itself is a very high number, over 16 million in fact. But it's not just the total number of colors that help to produce higher quality images, it's the use of those colors to produce features such as gradients or transition, shadows, transparencies, and various other lighting effects that also improve the quality. These squares are more commonly referred to as pixels, as I had just mentioned a moment ago, which by the way is a contraction of picture element, in case you've ever wondered where that term originated, and the display resolution is generally referenced by how many pixels wide and how many pixels high the display can support. For example, you might see a display resolution listed as 1680 by 1050. This indicates that there are 1680 independent rows of pixels arranged across the screen from left to right and 1050 rows of pixels arranged from top to bottom. Now, you may also see values such as DPI, which stands for dots per inch, and it quite literally is just a count of how many dots, or in this case pixels, there are in a linear inch. But DPI is typically used more commonly with printed images as opposed to the resolution of your screen. The more applicable term with respect to a display is PPI, which is pixels per inch. In both cases, the more pixels that are used to create an image, the higher the quality you'll get. But it should be pointed out that there is a bit of a breakpoint, if you will. In other words, in terms of what the human eye can detect. At some point, increasing the PPI or DPI value for something like a saved photograph will really only have any visible effect if you greatly zoom in on the image. So if you're satisfied with the quality of an image, such as a photograph, increasing its DPI or PPI value will really only result in making the file larger. With respect to the background light source, all LCD screen types still rely on some kind of backlighting for their illumination. So there are two primary methods of providing that light, which are cold cathode fluorescent light, or CCFL, and light-emitting diodes, or LED. CCFL lighting relies on a standard fluorescent light behind the display, but some models may use more than one to help produce more even distribution. But if there are multiple lights, then each one requires its own inverter, which converts DC power into AC. Now, as mentioned, this can help to produce more even lighting, but the more inverters you have, the more power the unit will draw, and the heavier it will be, and it might also produce more heat. By contrast, LEDs do not require inverters. They can run directly from the DC power of the motherboard and are therefore more efficient and environmentally friendly. The greater efficiency also means less energy waste in the form of heat. So the common question then is, why would anyone use CCFL over LED? Well, as is the case with many technological advances, CCFL was cheaper. But these days the cost of LED has dropped and has pretty much become the standard. Looking at some of the performance measurements for LCD monitors, the response time is a measure of how quickly any given pixel can respond to a change. which is typically measured in milliseconds. Now, that begs the question of how to define a change, particularly since there are over 16 million colors. So in this context, change is defined by the two extremes of going from completely black to completely white, then back to black. In current models, a respectable response time should be somewhere around 10 milliseconds. Although for users such as gamers or maybe graphic designers, values as low as 1 millisecond would be desired, but as you might expect, the lower the response time, the higher the cost. Lastly, LCD in itself is not a single type of technology. There are several different iterations, each with its pros and cons. So first off, we have in-plane switching or IPS, super plane to line switching or PLS, vertical alignment or VA panel technology, and twisted nematic or TN panel technology, and transistor translator logic or TTL. Now, quickly going through each one of these, in-plane switching typically is considered to have the best color accuracy and viewing angles and overall image quality of most LCD displays. But the subsequent technologies would usually offer some enhancements to specific performance considerations. For example, super plane to line switching was originally developed by Samsung, and it is very similar to IPS, but it tends to be a little bit brighter, and also claims to increase the viewing angle to reduce the amount of image distortion as you increase the angle. But it could require more power due to the increased brightness. Then vertical alignment is somewhere in between the twisted nematic and the IPS. It does offer wider viewing angles and better quality, but it had slower response times. Twisted nematic then does offer faster response time, making them the preferred choice for gamers, but they didn't have quite the range in terms of viewing angles and contrast ratios, and they also draw more power. Lastly, TTL is actually more of a protocol or a processing method that describes a monitor that accepts digital signals only as opposed to digital and/or analog, such as an RGB or red, green, blue display, also known as component video. And in most cases, it also used lower voltages. So TTL processing is not very common in today's more demanding displays. All told, in most of today's business environments, it's likely that just about any LCD monitor would be more than sufficient for standard office activities. It's really not until you get into the very specific applications of gaming, animation, 3D rendering, or graphic design that you'd start to see the higher end models. So in most cases, for most people, it usually just comes down to finding a satisfactory model for the right price. In this video, we'll examine one of the later technologies in use for displays, organic light-emitting diodes, or OLED, which is a very thin display that does not require any kind of backlighting. More specifically stated, each pixel of the image provides its own lighting and can therefore control its own luminosity, which can result in higher picture quality overall. But we'll get into the specifics in just a moment. So to get started, OLED technology uses organic compounds to produce light through what's known as electroluminescence, or more simply stated, passing electricity through those components so that they produce light. This is accomplished by placing the organic components within what's known as a thin film transistor, or TFT, which itself is then placed between an anode, or a device that produces a positive electric charge, and a cathode, which produces a negative electric charge. In short, the electric charge would flow from the anode through the OLED material to the cathode. And as the electricity passes through the organic compounds with varying parameters such as voltage and amplitude, the various levels of light and color would be produced. That said, there are two different types of OLED, passive matrix OLED or PM OLED, and active matrix OLED or AM OLED. And like most things in technology, each approach has its pros and cons. So beginning with the passive matrix, this uses an approach that controls the image processing sequentially, one line or one row at a time, without using the thin film transistor or the TFT, which itself contains a storage capacitor, which we'll come back to in a moment. So by not using the TFT, most of the pixels in any given line are actually off most of the time, resulting in an image that is not as bright. So to compensate, higher voltages are used, making them less efficient than the active matrix, and due to the higher voltage, over time the organic compounds themselves tended to degrade, which decreased the lifespan of the display. So none of that makes the passive matrix seem like a good choice, but of course they were cheaper to manufacture. Active, however, does use the TFT and its associated storage capacitor, which can maintain the state of any given pixel line, producing a brighter and more consistent image. But of course, they were more expensive. Now, that all said, once again, like most things in technology, the cost of active matrix devices has come down since its inception, and most OLED devices these days are likely using the active matrix, with the passive matrix only being used on specialized screens with lower resolution requirements, such as MP3 players, GPS devices, or other dedicated task devices. So then, if we compare OLED to an LCD screen that uses standard LED, if you will, The primary difference is that OLED can control the lighting on a pixel-by-pixel basis, whereas an LED-lit LCD screen relies on backlighting or on some smaller devices, edge lighting. So OLED can offer a degree of dexterity and control that simply isn't possible with LED LCD. But as we so often see, there are still pros and cons of each. Most notably, the color capabilities. Most LCD screens these days can produce exceptional color quality, but it does still depend on the underlying technology being used, such as in-plane switching and vertical alignment, both of which offer better color than something like twisted pneumatic, which tended to look washed out, especially as the viewing angle increased. OLED displays don't really have any issues with viewing angles due to the fact that each pixel produces its own light. But early OLED devices especially had difficulty with color accuracy and keeping them realistic to the eye. And while that specific aspect has improved over time, even the latest models can have problems with color volume, which refers to difficulty in maintaining even and accurate color saturation as brightness increases, meaning that for very bright scenes, the brightness simply overwhelms the color saturation so colors don't look as sharp. Now, as for the viewing angle, as just mentioned, OLED displays, by comparison to LED, will generally offer a higher quality image even from significant viewing angles because each pixel produces its own light, and because OLED displays are very thin and the pixels are very close to the surface. So for something like a TV in your living room, it means that many viewers spread out in different spots won't lose out on image quality. LCD screens can vary, but again, it does depend on the underlying technology. For example, as just mentioned, in-plane switching, or IPS, significantly improved upon this issue over technologies such as vertical alignment. And in fact, IPS has become the most prominent technology for LCD screens, so the viewing angle itself is much less of an issue these days than it used to be. Plus, you also have to consider the application. Several people watching TV spread out within a room is really one of the most prevalent examples of when the viewing angle would really be an issue. For general computer use, users are going to be directly facing their display virtually 100% of the time, which of course negates the issue on its own. It might be slightly more of an issue with handheld devices such as phones or tablets, since you might not always hold them at the perfect viewing angle, but again, the improvements made by the IPS technology will in most cases overcome those angles as well. Something else to consider when comparing display types is certainly the overall brightness, and this tends to be where LED and LCD win out over OLED, particularly for outdoor use for devices such as phones and tablets, where you might be competing with direct sunlight. And it's also something to consider when viewing high dynamic range or HDR video. Now, this is something that is typically more of a concern for TVs, but handhelds these days are continually promoting their video performance, so it's something to consider with phones and tablets too. The standard units of measure when it comes to brightness are usually either in nits or lumens. The nit refers to the brightness of a candle per square meter, whereas a lumen is just more of a defined standard that doesn't really relate to any day-to-day object like a candle, but in both cases, the higher the value, the brighter the display. Finally, contrast refers to the ratio of dark to light, and this is where OLED tends to win out, most notably due to the fact that since each pixel of an OLED display emits and controls its own light, up to and including emitting no light. In other words, the pixel can be entirely turned off. With an LED LCD display, there is always a back or an edge light, so particularly when it comes to reproducing a black pigment, a pixel that emits no light produces a true representation of black as opposed to a pixel that is just doing its best to block out the backlight. Contrast ratios for top-end LED LCD screens these days might be somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 to 1, meaning that the brightest pixel is 1,000 times brighter than the darkest. But with OLED, since a pixel can emit no light at all, the ratio is only limited by how bright the pixel can get, so it can almost be thought of as an infinite ratio. But of course, in practical terms, there is certainly a limit as to how bright the pixel can get, but in short, LED LCD can never get as dark as OLED can. Ultimately, the display qualities that anyone should look for are going to depend on many factors, but most notably, it should come down to the type of device and how it's being used. For example, you should not look for the same qualities in a gaming monitor as you would for a phone. They just aren't used in the same manner. So just be mindful of the application when determining the best type of display for your needs. In this presentation, we'll discuss some key considerations with respect to mobile display components, in particular such as those found in laptops, tablets, and phones, beginning with the fact that most mobile devices use LCD technology for their displays, which immediately offers several advantages, including the fact that it's a lightweight technology, which is a primary concern for a device that you carry around with you. And LCD offers low power consumption, which again is ideal for devices that run on battery, and perhaps best of all, it's relatively inexpensive, which keeps the overall cost of your devices down. Now, I realize that statement is relative as well, but particularly for some of the younger viewers, I can assure you that this is the case. As an example, about 20 years ago, I purchased a high-quality business laptop that cost me over $3,500. The laptop I'm using right now, which I bought only 2 years ago, is also a very high-quality business model, and it cost me about $1,700. So prices have certainly come down despite the vast technological improvements that have occurred. But of course, there are always disadvantages as well. For instance, LCD relies on backlighting or edge lighting for its illumination. Since this light is always on when using the device, there really is no true representation of black, which can become challenging if your job is in graphic design or requires any kind of color matching. And if you start to lose the backlight through standard wear and tear, then the image itself may become difficult or even impossible to see, rendering it unusable, even though everything else in the unit may be functioning perfectly. Now, that said, you may be able to replace the screen or the failed light, but that can be costly and you might be without the device for an extended period, which tends to be an unacceptable situation for most mobile users. So it often results in replacing the entire device itself just for the sake of the failed light. Now, the problem with color representation can be overcome by using an organic light-emitting diode or OLED display. OLED does offer more reliable reproduction of colors because OLED does not use a backlight. Each pixel emits its own light. So, for example, when needing to reproduce black, the pixel can simply turn itself off and emit no light, which is effectively what black is, the absence of light. However, OLED tends to be more expensive than LCD, which would of course drive up the cost of the device. And they tend not to be used in mobile devices such as laptops because the organic components can degrade over time, leading to decayed images still being displayed on the screen. Plus, some OLED devices tend to require more power than LCD, which of course can drain the battery more quickly. That all said, it should be mentioned that you may find OLED used in many handheld devices such as phones and tablets because most of the time those devices are off, at least in terms of the display, which helps to extend the lifespan of the organic components and of course the battery life. Another key component of a mobile display is of course the touchscreen capability, and these are certainly available on many laptops, but in today's environment, it's much more of a concern when using our phones and tablets. The underlying component of a touchscreen is known as a digitizer, which interprets the taps of our fingers into digital commands that can be accepted as input. Virtually every touchscreen these days accepts your finger as the input mechanism, but many devices also support a stylus, or a digital pen, if you will, which is far more accurate, particularly if you need to draw, sketch, or use cursive writing. Now, while this next component really doesn't play any part in how you view the display, it is worth mentioning the antenna, because if you're working on the display of a device, particularly a laptop, you're bound to encounter one or more antennas, as the screen is where the built-in antennas are placed. This is because on a laptop, the screen is the upright or vertical component, so it's the highest point of the device, if you will, and therefore the best placement option for ensuring the best quality signal. Now, there may also be multiple types of antennas for different types of communications that are supported, such as Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or cellular. So again, the antennas certainly don't play a role in the quality of the display itself, but they are still components of the display unit. On a similar note, webcams are another component that have no direct effect on the display, but they are still often a component of the display. So again, if you're servicing the display of a device such as a laptop, you're also bound to encounter a built-in webcam. Most every laptop these days will have a webcam as a standard option, but some older models may not have one, so it will depend on the age of the unit. Now, despite the name webcam, many models also have a built-in microphone to handle the audio so that you can conduct video calls and conferences without any additional hardware. And of course, remember that if you are servicing a device with a built-in webcam, if you have to do any software reconfiguration, such as reloading the entire operating system, you will likely have to reinstall the driver for the webcam to restore its functionality as well. Lastly, like the webcam, there may also be a built-in microphone, also located in the display of your unit. Now, of course, we did just mention that if there is a built-in webcam, then it could have its own microphone also built in. But it will depend on the make and model. In some cases, the webcam and the microphone will be separate objects. Or there may be both a built-in mic with the webcam and a separate microphone that is dedicated for audio use. Again, it will depend on the model. If it is built in, it should be mentioned that it might not be in the display. In fact, it could be integrated into just about any part of the case, but the screen is still the most common because it catches your voice at the most direct angle, if you will, and the built-in mics are usually more than adequate for general purpose activities such as teleconferencing, but they would not be suitable for creating content such as recording music or doing any kind of sound engineering. Dedicated devices would be required in those instances, but they would almost never be included as a built-in or standard component. So again, while several of these display components don't relate to the quality of the image you see, they are still components of the display unit of many mobile devices. So for servicing technicians in particular, they need to be taken into consideration when working on mobile devices.